Hello and welcome back. Today we're going to cover Section 18, Hazardous Materials, or commonly known as HazMat. Guys, HazMat is typically kind of referred to one of those things that everyone, when you hear HazMat, you just sigh and roll your eyes and you know it's going to be a PowerPoint of death. And this is no different. But what we're going to do is we're going to talk about HazMat and how we as a volunteer fire department are going to handle diagnosing and addressing a hazmat scene. Hazmat is really one of the scariest things that we can encounter on any given day. Our exposure to hazmat materials is gigantic. And we don't even realize it how often we come into very close contact with anything that's considered hazmat. And our awareness and our ability to recognize a hazardous material situation is going to be really critical in how that scene ultimately ends and comes to a conclusion. Now, I'm going to tell you right now, we don't do hazmat cleanup, period. All we do is hazmat awareness and recognition, okay? It is not our job to clean these scenes up. And there is a distinction there. For us, hazmat would be incredibly expensive to try and certify and maintain and equip. It's an incredibly specialized field. It's incredibly difficult to maintain the currency, and it's incredibly expensive for all the equipment. And at the end of the day, we're just not going to deal with it. And when we do encounter a hazmat scenario, we're going to literally shift the responsibility to another organization. Without further ado, sit down, log in, and be ready. This is a long one. Hood County and a realistic first responder approach. Okay, so we get toned out to, let's say, a car accident or potentially a structure fire at a acid factory or some other industrial plant, okay? And as we're approaching that scene, maybe we notice, a ruptured tank and a giant plume of vapor is leaking out of that tank, or the fire is burning a really funny color and it's giving off nothing but a red smoke. Or we see an overturned trailer and we see a bunch of liquid literally flowing out of the tank. Okay? As we make scene and as we approach that scene, we want to approach uphill and upwind. It's kind of obvious why. We don't want the fluids leaking down to us, and we don't want the gases blowing into us. So always uphill and upwind, and don't walk through the scene to get uphill or upwind. Take the long way. Now look for signs of exposure. What are we talking about here? Well, this is the really obvious stuff. Fluids leaking, tanks ruptured, very oddly colored fires. Okay? If you see something blatantly obvious, don't run up to it. Look for placards from a safe distance. You see that overturned trailer, perhaps it's a 18-wheeler going down the road and you see the placards on the back or the sides of the trailer. Take a look at them before you get up to the trailer. All the trucks have binoculars. Use the binoculars to look at the placards before you just walk up to the trailer. All victims cannot be saved. I can't emphasize this enough. Okay? Sometimes there is just certain chemicals and certain materials that are involved that you're going to have to be able to make a decision, and it's not going to be an easy one. It's going to be a really terrible decision that you don't have the proper equipment to try and make a rescue. This is important that you realize that you can't save everyone. What are you realistically potentially creating in this scenario? Another victim. Be careful. There's going to be times when you're just going to have to make a really hard decision. That's just the nature of this industry. Big one here. Call Chemtrek. We'll talk about how to find that phone number and where it's located and what they do, but don't ever be afraid to give them a call. Follow the ERG to the letter, Emergency Response Guidebook. Well, that's what this whole slideshow is about, is that book. We're going to go through it in detail. And then evacuate as needed. Okay? If you show up and you have a tanker car on fire, okay? Railroad tanker car on fire, and it's in the middle of a neighborhood right here in Granbury, you need to start actually evacuating the houses and the closing streets down and getting people out of the area. It has nothing to do with ever approaching the physical fire. That's a hard decision to make, and you need to make it really quick. Here's how you'd make that decision. You show up and you're like, oh my God, this is terrible. That's a really good indicator that you probably need to start evacuating. Here's the kicker. How far? Well, let's make it simple. Let's start with the closest people and residences and businesses located right there to the scene. At least 3 or 4 houses in a circle around that scene. Remember though, do not go downhill and do not go downwind. You need to be cognizant of these. Always keep your head on a swivel when you're having to deal with the flow path of these materials and you're starting an evacuation. Analyze an incident to determine the presence of hazardous materials, WMDs, also known as weapons of mass destruction, and along with the appropriate basic hazard. What are the hazardous materials and the risks associated? What are the potential outcomes associated with the hazardous materials emergency, and how to recognize the presence of hazardous materials and WMDs? Okay, we've got a nice little picture here on the right side. We're just going to use this as our classic, just picturesque example. Okay, and what are the hazardous materials? Does this look like a hazardous material? At first glance, yes. And what are the risks associated? Well, the first one is there was obviously an accident. The second one is that the trailer's on its side, so it's not necessarily stable. But let's particularly look at just the around the area. This isn't an interstate. This actually looks like to be much more of a rural area. Looks like that's a dirt road, trees, ditch, possibly a stream next to it. Is there any risks associated with having an overturned diesel truck next to a river? These are the things that we're going to be looking for. Okay, what are the potential outcomes associated with the hazmat emergency? Well, again, if we look at this bottom right picture, first thing that we have to deal with is the diesel leak. The second thing we have to be cognizant of is a potential fire. And third, and by far the absolute biggest, is the actual environmental impact. These are things that we need to be reacting to really quick. How to recognize the presence of hazardous materials and WMDs. This is kind of a trick question. I don't want you to run up there and taste the red snow. I don't want you to sniff it. I really don't even want you to do more than look at it. So how do we recognize the presence? Well, the first one is take the obvious signs. Pretty obvious that trailer is leaking something and it's red. So we know that that's a chemical of something. Okay. The other thing that we can be looking for is the placards. Here's a third one, and a sneaky one. Look for the driver or the operator of the piece of equipment. Case in point, if you show up to a train derailment and you see the engineer running down the road, there's a really good chance that he's not just out for a jog. you probably ought to go chase him down and figure out why he's running. He's running because he knows what's on the train, and he knows what happens when it's not in a stable, contained state anymore, and there's a good chance you're going to be going with him much further away from the scene. Identify the definitions of hazardous materials and weapons of mass destruction. Guys, I want you to think about this real quick. What is a hazardous material? What does a hazardous material actually do? What's a hazardous material classification? And then let's go down to weapons of mass destruction. What do you guys think a weapon of mass destruction is? Give me a definition. A hazmat is defined as substances in quantities or forms that may pose a reasonable risk to health, property, or the environment. A weapon of mass destruction is going to be any weapon that causes a large health risk, injury risk, or structural damage or risk to a population. These are the hazard classes and divisions of hazardous materials and weapons of mass destruction. Class 1's explosives, Class 2's flammable gases, Class 3's flammable liquids, Class 4's flammable solids, Class 5 is oxidizers, Class 6 is toxics, substance and infectious substances, Class 7 is radioactive materials, Class 8 is corrosive materials, and Class 9 is miscellaneous. Guys, this is basically just a dumpster bin of all the stuff that can kill you. I don't really care at what class something falls into. If it's in the ERG, it's bad for you. That's why it has a placard, and that's why it's in these classes. So definitely take note of just the placards in general. They're there to tell you, hey, this crap's dangerous or toxic or terrible for the environment, so you need to pay attention and look up and see what you're actually dealing with. What is the difference between a hazardous materials versus a weapons of mass destruction incident and other emergencies? Really simply, the difference is that a hazmat is ultimately caused either just from blatant negligence or just a pure accident, and WMD incidents are intentional. The big thing here is that ultimately, what's the resulting effect? Weapons of mass destruction's effect is intentional. The hazardous materials events are not intentional. Again, they may be caused by stupidity or people trying to hide something or an accident, but it's not intentional. It's not intentional in the effect of trying to cause damage, trying to cause chaos, and physically trying to kill people. Now, size is a unique way to look at these events. Okay, you can have a weapons of mass destruction event that's small in size. Okay, same for hazmat materials. I mean, you can have a tiny amount of a substance and it be incredibly toxic. Complexity is a really interesting way to look at a hazmat event. It's one of the main reasons that us as a volunteer fire department that we don't do hazmat, because of how complex it is and how expensive. We've already talked about intent. Crime scene management. This is a real big one. Okay, in the event that you're on a hazmat event and you are physically having to protect a scene, that might be requested either by the fire marshal or by law enforcement. The accident itself was not intentional, but it may have been a meth cook driving down the highway that had an accident. Okay, we need fire personnel now to actually maintain fire protection on the scene while the police do their crime scene investigation and management. Okay, the big one, secondary devices, attacked and then armed attacks. This is strictly related to weapons of mass destruction events. Guys, a classic example of this is you have, and I'm going to give you a scenario. You have a bomb that went off at a church. Okay? The bomb itself killed and injured people. But after that event, what shows up to that event? Well, you have all the first responders, you have the police, and you have a lot of law enforcement individuals that show up to that event. The secondary attack might be a larger bomb that is intended to go off after the arrival of the police and fire departments, or the shooting happens after there's more government employees on scene. I know it's real simple to sit here and just roll your eyes and say, man, this is never going to happen here. Let me tell you guys, we live in a time and an age when there's people that have all sorts of agendas, and there's many things in our area that have a lot of interest, not only at a federal level, but also at a state level. You have the nuclear power plant down on the Hood County Somerville border. You have 2 other large power plants in the area. We have several large munitions manufacturers that are in the Crescent area. Then you look at how many churches that we have in this area. Then you also have all of our schools. The sad fact is, guys, is this is something that we really do have to be aware of. And when you go to these potential scenes, unfortunately, you need to be paying attention to it, because you don't know when or how these events happened and what the ultimate intent is. Buildings and locations in the community where hazardous materials and WMDs are manufactured, transported, stored, used, or disposed of. Okay, let's just start with the WMDs. Again, we have a nuclear power plant. Now, one thing to really consider here is that assuming someone was stupid enough and armed well enough to even make a run at the nuclear power plant, the power plant's got its own private security, and I assure you they don't have slingshots. But assuming that the terrorist would even be able to get near the nuclear reactor, the chances of them being able to get into the reactor is slim to none. So the only other thing that they could make a possible run at is at the uranium fuel rods that are stored on site and away from the reactors. Well, they're going to need a large crane to be able to physically pick up one of those rods, because they're not stored individually. So you would have to pick up a whole pack of rods, and I think they're in the ballpark of around 175,000 pounds. So realistically for us, we don't really have to worry about someone stealing a uranium rod. Now, let's go on the hazmat side. Guys, hazardous materials are everywhere, period. Okay? They are in our businesses, they are in our mom and pop shops, they are in big box stores, they are in our personal houses, and they are in Farmer Brown's shed in his big barn. Okay? Hazardous materials are everywhere. Okay? They're transported in everything. They're stored in every conceivable place. They're used universally across all applications. And then the kicker is typically, how are they disposed? Well, disposal's very expensive. Here's the problem. You think Farmer Brown actually disposes of a single thing of his hazardous materials, his oils, his solvents, his greases, the paints? No. Best case scenario, he just digs a hole and throws them in there. Worst case scenario, he just stores it all in his barn. Let's look at someone's personal house. You have a ton of chemicals in your house. Where are they stored at? Well, they're kept in the garage, or they're kept under the sink, possibly in the bathrooms. Same thing. What do you do when you get rid of those items? Yeah, I realize we're all supposed to take them to a specific place, and dispose of them. But I know you don't. You take yours and throw yours away in the trash, just like everyone else. Guys, our exposure to hazardous materials is everywhere. It is the one thing that I guarantee you that you are exposed to every single call, and you don't even pay attention to it. Container shapes that indicate the presence of hazmats or WMDs. Okay, well, typically if they're transporting WMDs, a terrorist at least, it's going to be hidden. Now, the government actually does transport nuclear weapons and those nuclear fuel rods for reactors. And if you've ever seen one of those convoys going down the road, you would think that they're in Syria with the amount of armed traffic that's escorting those apparatus down the highways. Now let's focus on the hazmat side. Non-bulk containers, 119 gallons or less of liquid. And we see a great example of that of one of the plastic crates. It's a plastic crate wrapped in metal, and they typically have placards attached to them. Bulk containers, 119 gallons or more. You see the tanker trailer there at the top right. Once again, it's placard. And then you've got fixed facility storage systems. Bottom picture, we see some storage tanks for whatever facility this is, and same thing, they've got some placards and notices written there on the containers themselves. And then we have pipelines, and then ships and marines vessels. Well, pipelines, if you just dug up a random pipeline, you're not going to find a physical label attached to that pipeline. But if you walk down the pipeline a little ways, you will find something somewhere, usually a placard of some type, somewhere near a well site that's going to be telling you what's going through that pipe. And then I'm not going to go through ships or marine vessels, because the day we have a ship come up Lake Cranberry is the day we'll talk about it. Facility and transportation markings and colors that indicate hazardous materials and WMDs. Guys, this is where you need to go online, type in hazmat markings, and start looking at what's posted online. I'm not going to go through all of this. Also, when you come to the station and we do our skills and our hands-on stuff, we'll go through the ERG book a lot more detail, and we'll physically look at all of these labels, placards, and markings. NFPA 1704 marking describe the significance of colors, numbers, and special symbols. Okay, so really the placard we're looking at is that center diamond. Okay, you see where it says acid 241. All right, let's start with the acid. That's a specific hazard correction there, and they're going to physically tell you what that specific hazard is. It's going to be an acid, an alkali, corrosive, oxidizer, radioactive, or use no water. That's a really important one to pay attention to, and there's a reason that they put that on there. What do you think that is? Now let's look at that too. That blue label, those are health hazards. Okay, the red label's fire hazard, and the yellow label is a reactivity hazard. Now, I want you to realize that those are labeled from 0 to 4. The higher the number, the worse it is. Okay, so once you start getting out of the number 1 range is when you guys need to be really careful. Okay, anything that's ever labeled with a placard, you have got to look it up in the ERG. It is not up for debate. Look it up so you know how to handle it. Identify U.S. and Canadian placards and labels that indicate hazardous materials and WMDs. See the ERG or the Department of Transportation chart. Yes, go see the ERG and we'll figure out what they're trying to tell us in the ERG. Identify the following basic information on a material safety data sheet, MSDS, and shipping papers for hazardous materials. Okay, guys, this is actually a really important book. I'm not going to go into full detail on the MSDSs, but every possible single thing that you would ever need for that material is going to be on an MSDS. Here's the kicker, and this is a big one. Who or where is going to have an MSDS? If you look at the transportation side, planes, trains, automobiles, it's the driver operator that's going to have the MSDS. Okay, so in the event that you show up to a train derailment or a plane crash or a vehicle accident, that driver is going to have the MSDS sheets. Now, it may not be in a binder, but he's going to have the paperwork associated with that material. Okay, I'm not going to go into the major sections of the MSDS. It's really plainly written. I mean, it tells you step by step by step what the product is, the quantities of it, and how to handle that material and all the safety precautions associated with it. Identify entries on shipping papers that indicate the presence of hazardous materials. The presence is indicated in the MSDS, period. Match the name of the shipping papers found in transportation with the mode of transportation. This is kind of self-explanatory. If you find the MSDS in the accident scene, you had the paperwork. Identify the person responsible for having the shipping papers in each mode of transportation. Again, it's the driver operator. Now, the only caveat to this is when you get to a train driver or the conductor. Who has the paperwork? What do you think? The answer is the conductor. The driver won't have it. Identify where the shipping papers are found in each mode of transportation. Unfortunately, these are not going to be in specific places. It's going to be different in an airplane. It's going to be different in a vehicle, and it's going to be different in a train. What you need to find is the person that has the papers. And lastly, identify where the papers can be found in an emergency in each mode of transportation. Again, go look for the driver. Identify examples of clues other than occupancy, location, container shape, marking colors, placards, labels, MSDS, and shipping papers. The sight, sound, and odor of which indicate hazardous materials and WMDs. Okay, guys, do not go up to a wrecked tanker truck and taste something. Period. All right. Now, let's go to the site. Let's start with what we see. Okay, if you see a leak, you have a leak. Period. If you see a vapor cloud emitting from a container, you have a vapor cloud. All right. You might also hear the leak. All right. And I can tell you, if you're getting to the point of where you're tasting it and you're smelling it, guess what? You're too close. Here's the kicker. Now, you might be operating on a scene, and you've been on scene for 2 hours and you haven't had any problems. But if you start seeing, smelling, hearing, or tasting the chemical in the air, get out of there. You don't have to stay there. Leave. Limitations of using the senses in determining the presence or absence of hazardous materials. Okay, guys, so you're working a scene, okay, and your sense of smell is going to be realistically one of the most sensitive sensory receptors that you have. But it's also the sense that's going to fade the fastest. Once it gets acclimated to that smell, it's going to fade and it's not going to bother you as much. And because of that, you're going to have this tendency to sit there and think, well, the smell's dissipating. I'll be able to sit here. No, what's happening is your sense of smell is becoming acclimated to it, and it's giving you a false sense of security. Now, let's go to sight. Okay, if you see a hazmat leaking, you don't sit there and wait until it's finished leaking to then tell everyone else that it's done. All right, your sense of sight is going to be your most reliable and safe method of being able to detect a hazmat, okay? But you may not be able to physically see the leak, the rupture, the puncture, whatever caused the degradation to the container to then cause the actual leak. So your site isn't necessarily guaranteed to be able to verify it. This goes to being able to hear it. If you hear a ruptured tank, if you stay in the area and the rupture is finally done at an audible level, does it mean that all the gas is gone from the area? Absolutely not. What if it's heavier than air? You might be standing in it. Four possible locations that could be targets for criminal or terrorist activity using hazardous materials and WMDs. Guys, again, we have to take a sad, serious look at this. All right. Realistically, if we're dealing with a terrorist event, it's going to be at a public place. Schools, parks, churches, the square, sporting events locally. This is where this stuff's going to occur at. Don't think just because you're in Little Granbury that you don't have the potential for a terrorist event. Describe the difference between a chemical and a biological incident. Chemical is characterized by rapid onset of symptoms, and biological is symptoms required several days or weeks to manifest. Okay, we're talking about terrorist events here. Okay, occasionally it is possible to have a hazardous materials outbreak, from a hospital. A couple of years ago, we had an Ebola outbreak in Africa, and one of the doctors ended up in the Dallas area for treatment. And then from there, a handful of other people were exposed to Ebola. Okay. And those people were contained and monitored for a very long time just to monitor their symptoms for that period to see if they ever actually got infected. Now, a chemical attack or a accidental hazmat release of chemicals, you're going to have just a damn near immediate impact of that substance on the people in the area. 4 indicators of possible criminal or terrorist activity. Okay, so you show up on scene. Guys, I want you to think about what you're going to potentially see and then turn around and say, wow, that's odd. What on earth is that doing here? Okay. A really good example of this is we're going to go down to the illicit laboratories. It's not uncommon for the fire department to show up on scene for a medical emergency and stumble into a meth lab. I've had it happen a couple of times. People are having a breathing difficulty. Well, they're having a breathing difficulty because of the crap that they're trying to make wrong. So, don't rule out what you'll stumble into. And you're not going into it prepared for a hazmat event. You're going to it for a breathing difficulty. You're not going into it with the mindset of, oh, they're making illegal drugs, so I need to make sure I bring my rescue truck and not the squad. Let's go up to the chemical agents. You're looking for the typical, just ridiculous laboratory. If you've ever seen some of the TV shows like Breaking Bad, you're going to have a laboratory set up, and that's going to work for the chemical and biological agents. All right. I'll be honest with you, I've never stumbled into anything like this, and I'm not planning on it either. Radiological elements and agents. Guys, again, realistically, you're not going to just stumble into that. It's someone's house, but you can find it in like a hospital. Okay, you have various types of radioactive materials that are used or present at those facilities. And then ultimately explosives and secondary devices, massive amounts of black powder or, ammonium nitrate and diesel. Again, I hate to say it this way, but you're just looking for things that are really out of place and really odd. It's not normal for someone to have a whole bunch of Bunsen burners and beakers and, glassware set up in a living room. That's not normal. It's just not. Those are indicators that something else is going on. Identify hazardous materials and WMDs involved in each situation by name, the UN identification number, or type placard applied by completing the following requirements. Difficulties finding specific names of hazardous materials at facilities and in transportation. Guys, you have Google. You have cell phones. There's chances are there's someone that has a smartphone with them on scene. And in worst case scenario, your phone's dead, you didn't bring it, the computer doesn't work in the truck. Call dispatch over the radio and ask them to look up that material. The last thing is you can always call for a fire marshal to come out and check the scene out for you. Or if you're in the city fire inspector. Sources for obtaining the names of the UN identification number or types of placards associated with hazardous materials in transportation. Again, check with the physical driver or operator of the apparatus. Check in the compartment where the driver or operator sits. And if that doesn't work, call the company or the manufacturer of the material. If it's in a company truck, call them. Tell them, this is what happened. This is the vehicle. They can look it up for you. Call dispatch. Call the state troopers. Call the fire marshal. Call the city fire inspector. You've got options. There's lots of people that are around you, and their sole purpose is to help you. Do not be afraid to utilize your resources for these situations. Sources for obtaining the names of hazmat and WMDs at a facility. Okay. Same thing. This is something where you're just going to have to ask around on scene. Okay, you need to ask for a manager. You need to ask for a supervisor. You need to ask for, people in specific departments like shipping and handling. Ask for the owner. And if you can't get a response or find any of those people, again, go to your outside agencies and get help coming in to you. Identify the fire, explosion, and health hazard information for each material by using the current edition of the Department of Transportation Emergency Response Guidebook. Okay, this is your Junior Woodchuck Hazardous Materials book. This is a fantastic piece of information here. They're available online, they're available on apps, and we have a physical copy of each book in all of our trucks. Actions to be taken to protect themselves and others and to control access to a scene by completing the following requirements. Okay, guys, the next few slides are now to use the ERG book effectively. And we're going to go through all of this stuff in the next couple of slides. I'm not even going to read through it. I just looked ahead at the next couple of slides. We're going to actually scroll through these next couple of slides pretty quick. So you'll get about a 3 to 5 second transition. I think it's somewhere in there. And you're going to go through slides 21 all the way down to slide 33 before I'm going to start speaking again. So don't wig out and think something happened to the video or that I passed out. Guys, again, I'm going to cover this material for what we need in Granbury. All right, we do not want to be handling hazmat materials. I want us to recognize hazmat situations, and I want us to know how to use the ERG book. Okay, we finally made it. Now these next slides, what we're going to do is go into in-depth detail on how to physically use the Emergency Response Guidebook, the ERG. That's what I'm going to call it from this point on. Okay, this is what you're going to get when you use the ERG and how to properly use the ERG. We're going to be able to recognize and identify the hazardous material, either by its name, by the 4-digit ID number on the container, either by the placard description, and then worst case scenario, if we have to, by the container shape or design. Just the container itself will tell us a lot about the material. So a basic introduction to the ERG. The ERG is designed to provide first responders to an incident with guidelines for initial action. This is why this whole book's here. It's not intended for you to memorize all this crap. The book is there for you to use and look up and then figure out how to implement the plan prescribed by the ERG. It's also intended to provide assistance in the decision process. That's why the book is there. It is the layout, the game plan, the Junior Woodchuck Guidebook on how to handle these incidents. And although primarily for transportation incidents, the ERG can be used for campus-based releases and even in laboratories. Do not forget to read the entire book when you are actually determining your event and the substance you're dealing with. Color border for the ERG pages. Okay, there's actually 5 colors that we're going to deal with here. I realize there's only 4 pictured here, but there is 5. We have the white pages, yellow, blue, orange, and green. The ERG white pages. An example of information provided in the white section of the ERG. And if you look there tight on the right side, it shows you a picture of what the white pages do. Okay? And this is literally the first page. And I mean the first page of the ERG. And this page explains in detail how to actually use the book to run a hazardous material response. Okay, so even if this class is completely pointless and you have blacked out from boredom at this point and you are now sleeping on your keyboard, all you have to remember is just open up to the first page of the damn book and it'll tell you exactly what you need to do. Here's an additional example of white page information. All of a sudden, all of our placards are now provided to us. Okay, and that page showing placards provides information on what guide page to refer to, not guild, guide page. I got a typo in there. Now we're going to talk about the yellow pages here. Okay, and the additional information that's available in the yellow pages. These pages show the chemical by their ID number along with what guide number to follow. And if you look there on the right, it tells you at the very top of our picture the ID number. So we're just going to start with 1176. That's the very first one. The next thing it tells us is the guide number. Guide number is 129. Now it tells us the name of the material. Okay, I'm not going to try and read that because my screen's small and I don't want to sound stupid. But that's how you use a yellow page. The blue pages also gives us additional information. These pages show their chemical by their name along with the guide number to follow. Those chemicals highlighted in green have special hazards. So we're going to come back to that in a little bit. Let's go to the very first one that's circled in red. Okay, and if you look at the very top of the page, it says name of material We go down to the one that's circled in red. It's called chlorine. The guide number is 124 and the ID number is 1017. So if we went back to the yellow pages and looked up 1017, guess what we'd see? Chlorine. So those two pages are interactive with each other. Now, we also notice that chlorine is highlighted in green. So we know that it has a special hazard attached to it. So now that we have used either the yellow pages or the blue pages, we now come to the orange pages. And off of the yellow or blue pages, we get that guide number. And we take that guide number and we just look it up. Now here's the kicker on this. This is a great layout of a total guide number and the full format here. And it tells us, it will just start at the very top left, potential hazards. And then below that it goes into health hazards and it goes into fire explosion hazards. And we would read all of that. Then we go down to public safety. And we're going to read all that. And we're going to read what's the protective clothing requirements. Then we're going to read what the evacuation requirements are. But we're only half done. You got to remember, look at the other page. Notice how it says guide number 119 also. So now we have to look at what the emergency response is. And we need to read and see what it says for fire. And then continuing going down, spill or leak. And continuing down, first aid. Go through the full guide page. Do not read only half of it. This whole thing is chocked full of information that's critical to you. Once you get through the orange pages, do not forget, if you need to go through the green ERG pages. Green pages provide special information regarding those chemicals that have a high risk to life. So we go back to the one that's circled, and we go back to chlorine, okay? And if we start at the very top, it tells you small spill or a large spill. And then it tells you to either isolate in all directions and then to protect persons downwind. And then it also tells you day or night. And then it's got the same information for large spills. It is your total game plan. You start at the white pages, you go to the blue or yellow pages, you follow the orange pages, and you finish with the green pages. Now, I've got a nice little picture here that you can take a look at, and this is a simple test. And you can go in to Google, find the placard on this truck, go to Google and type in hazmat, and then type in the identification number off the placard and just tell me what you get. You might even get fancy with it and maybe try and download an ERG onto your smartphone. And if you don't have one, that's fine. We have them here at the station. You can take these presentations to the station and look them up. Here's some more stuff for you to look up, just to work you through the ERG a little bit more. Again, you can do this online. You can download an ERG app, or if you want, just come to the station and look this stuff up. But go ahead and play with the ERGs and learn how to use them properly and go through all this material. All right, this time we're going to cover section 17, ground cover firefighting. This is a fancy way to say that we're going to go fight a wildland fire. The one big precursor that I want to add to wildland firefighting is I actually truly believe that this is the most dangerous type of firefighting that we do. It's also very prevalent on certain years. You know, if we have a dry, hot summer, big drought conditions, and we start having a lot of wildland fires, the variety that you guys will run into on a wildland scene is just incredible. I've been to some very large wildland fires, you know, that are tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of acres. And I'm telling you, there's no way to control that. It is absolute chaos. They're incredibly dangerous scenes. Whereas if you look at structure firefighting, once you go through the rookie school, you know, realistically at the end of the day, that's a very controlled event. We have a truck that you're familiar with, you have gear that you're familiar with, you're wearing protective equipment that you're familiar with, you have air packs, you have hoses, nozzles, and water and hand tools, and then you're also working on scene with a whole bunch of other people that have been trained and educated and have experience. And at the end of the day, that event is contained to a box, a container, one specific place. And once you cross the line, you're in a very safe place. And you need to be cognizant of that in wildland firefighting, there's no safe space. They're incredibly dangerous scenes. And we're going to go into detail on this. Okay, we're going to define some wildfire terms as they're used in the fire service. So when we do mop-up on a wildland fire, it's probably one of the worst things that we actually do. Because for us, 99% of the time, all we're doing is driving around and squirting cow turds in a pasture. That's just what we do. Now, the other part of mop-up is that, and the definition part of it, is the fire's been extinguished. What we're doing is we're going around and doing a very thorough job on physically extinguishing the coals and embers of the fire. We want that fire cold, and cold means that all hot spots have been extinguished. Direct attack means that you're physically taking water from the hose and putting it directly on the fire. Indirect attack means that maybe you're running in front of the fire and you're putting a big wet line down in front of the fire. Okay, the fuel is going to be the wood, the tree, the leaves, the shrubs. Anything that's natural vegetation and burn is going to be the fuel. A backfire or burnout is going to be a fire that's set in front of the wildland fire to consume the fire, all the materials in front of the fire. A barrier is going to be something like a paved road, a lake, a river, a stream. Those are barriers. Topography is just the terrain details, hills, mountains, valleys, flat. That's all topography. Suppression is just our fire attack. Ground fire literally means that the materials on the ground are burning, so we're talking about a grass fire. And then we'll go through the different parts of a wildland fire. Continuing, we'll go through fire behavior on a wildland fire. We'll talk about who incident command is, and depending on the size of the scene, that post can become quite the monumental task. An incendiary fire. What is an incendiary fire? An incendiary fire is a fire that was intentionally set. Mutual aid is when we go to another area to help with a fire. So if Toller has a grass fire, we might mutual aid to Toller, or in a larger fire, if the Possum Kingdom area has a fire, we would mutual aid to Possum Kingdom, and vice versa. Possum Kingdom might come down here. Fire season, well, that's kind of self-explanatory. Typically for us, that's in the middle of summer or in the middle of winter. A convection column is only seen on a very large fire, and at that point the fires become so intense and so large, what it's doing is it's creating such a massive amount of heat that it's creating its own clouds associated with that fire. We'll go through the tools used in ground cover fires and ground firefighting. A crown fire is a fire, the bottom left or bottom right is a very good picture of a crown fire. Typically only seen in very large trees. Pine forests have crown fires. And then lastly, surface fires, which is going to be anything on the ground. Okay, this little slide has got a ton going on in it. The effect of fuel, weather, topography, and on wildfire and predict the direction and speed of the fire spread. Okay, the first thing that I want to talk about is the weather. 90% of your wildland fire and the speed and the direction and all the mitigating and consequential factors of that fire is directly related to the wind. These fires are going to be wind driven, and that's going to control the speed and the direction of the fire. The only other thing to really add to that is the slope of the terrain. Fire is going to burn uphill quicker, and that's basic fire science. You have radiation of the fire down below, and what it's doing is that heat is going uphill, and it's going to be preheating all the materials uphill so that it catches on fire faster. So the bigger the fire, the more convection and radiate, or not necessarily convection, a little bit convection, but a lot more radiation is going to be affecting that preheat going up. And it's going to, because the heat already goes up through the convective current, so that's going to be preheating uphill, and then the radiation uphill combined. And those two factors, the bigger the fire, the more preheating goes on, the faster that stuff catches on fire, the bigger the fire gets. So, and the slope of the terrain makes up about 10 to 15% of that equation. But wind is your number one factor, and you always want to have the fire in front of you and the wind to your back. That is the safest way. You do it the other way around, and the wind can get you in big trouble really quick. Now, one thing I want to talk about with the fuel is, if we look at the picture at the top right, you have a heavily forested area, and once those big trees are burning, that's a hell of a fire. A little fire truck's not going to put that fire out. You're going to have to be able to contain that fire. And in this case, they're trying to use a road that runs next to the subdivision to actually isolate the fire. But don't misunderstand that, something like grass is not being a big hot fire. Grass burns hot, and regardless whether it burns at 200 degrees or 1,000 degrees, those are temperatures that still kill you. And there's a lot of people that have been killed in Texas just from grass fires. Now, the other thing to consider with weather is dew point and humidity. If it's really humid, or you have a really heavy dew point on the ground, that fire is not going to spread really quick. But if it's really dry, everything's going to catch on fire faster. But for prediction of the direction and the speed of the fire, it's going to be wind and it's going to be topography 99% of the time. Construct a hand and wet fire lines using safe and effective both direct and indirect construction techniques to control the fire. So let's look at the very top one first, top right. You see a little brush truck there. You see a guy walking next to the brush truck, and he's literally spraying a water line down in what looks like an off-the-road path that's been beaten down, very short grass. And behind him, you can see another firefighter that's using what's called a drip torch, and he's intentionally lighting the grass on fire. What they're doing is a back burn, and they're doing that in combination with a wet fire line. It's a very effective technique for helping to put a large fire out by getting in front of it and extinguishing the fire. All the materials consumed before the large fire even gets close. Now, the bottom picture, as far as I'm concerned, is the absolute worst way on the planet to even consider trying to put out a fire, but I have to talk about it. What they're using is hand tools to dig up a dry fire line. The typical tools associated in doing this are picks, Pulaskis, and shovels. And you're insane if you consider this like even a reasonable way to attack a fire. You have trucks. We have trucks filled with water. Let's use those. Locate the fire relative to your present location and describe the factors involved to respond safely to that location within the response time standards of the department. Okay, first off, let's locate the fire. Well, find the smoke column on the horizon and drive towards it. That one's kind of self-explanatory. Now, assuming that you can't see a smoke column, maybe the wind's blowing too hard. You have dispatch, you have an address, plug it into a map, look it up on a map, and drive to that location. Now, the response time standards. When you're having a wildland fire, okay, maybe it's a mutual aid call and we're going to Possum Kingdom. Are they expecting us to be there in 8 minutes? No. Okay. And ultimately, one of the biggest things that I want to add to this is people have a tendency to drive like lunatics in brush trucks to try and get on scene. And I'm telling you right now, why? Why are we putting ourselves in such a significant hazard just trying to make scene? The fire's going to be there, I assure you. Take your safe precautions and don't drive like just a demonstrative moron while trying to get on scene of a grass fire. Okay, analyze the situation using proper procedures and organize this information into a clear, concise report of conditions necessary to develop an initial plan of action to control the fire within 2 hours. Wow. Okay, first off, these are awesome pictures, but I assure you, we don't have airplanes or tanks that we have at our disposal. So let's start with just the information in a clear, concise report. All right, one of the hardest things to do when you first start fighting these wildland fires in our area is to actually show up on scene and give a size up. All right, one of the easiest ways to do this is to simply describe what is going on. Okay, you need to tell them how large the fire is, what the fuel load is, and how fast it's moving. Okay, so it's either a small, medium, or large fire. What's the fuel load? Is it a grass fire? Is it in the middle of a field? Or is it in the middle of a cedar thicket? And then ultimately, how fast is it moving? How hard's the wind blowing? Okay, now, what is a small fire? Okay, this is completely subjective. What I call a small fire, you may call a medium fire. One of the easiest ways I look at it is if I know that 500 gallons of water that we carry on our trucks is going to extinguish that fire and do the mop up, that's a small fire. And if you need a visual reference, if you are in your truck, you pull up on scene and you can hold your hand out literally in front of you and cover up that whole fire, that's a small fire. Then you need to tell them what the fuels are and how fast it's moving. What is a medium-sized fire? For me, a medium-sized fire is in a field. Okay? It is in a field or in a cedar thicket, and it is several feet wide. Okay, what is several? For me, it's about 100 feet or more wide. That is a medium-sized fire. Again, then you would give them what the fuel load is and how fast it's moving. What is a large fire? Large fire for me is anything when I'm responding to it and I can see it driving from the station. If I see the column of smoke and I'm driving towards Crescent and I can already see the column of smoke pulling out from the station, it's a large fire. Complete the extinguishment of the fire by employing recognized mop-up techniques. We're going to go into more detail on this, but realistically, where your training for this really occurs is when you're on scene. Mop-up on a wildland fire is kind of tedious, and at the end of the day, you basically just got to squirt every single area with water. The branches, the trunks, everything on the ground, you got to turn it over. You just got to be thorough. Your typical fire hazards and recommend corrective actions which are within your authority and ability to do. Okay, if you are on a wildland fire and the wind suddenly shifts, you are officially in a hazard. If your truck gets stuck or it breaks down, you are officially in a hazard. Okay, and your corrective actions for whatever that hazard are 100% in your authority and better be in your ability to do. You have a wide variety of hazards that are on a scene. Everything from the fires burning in an area that's inaccessible, to wind shifts, to the fuel load picks up, wind speed changes. There's a million factors that go into this. And at the end of the day, you have the authority and the ability to dictate the corrective action every single time. You should always make a decision based on personal safety. List and describe the recognized safety practices and corrective actions to be taken to ensure the department does not have any injuries due to wildfire suppression efforts. Okay, safety practices and corrective actions. So again, I've already talked about that our wildland fires primarily and should be fought out of the back of a brush truck. Now, your safety practices are primarily going to be cognizant of the weather, which way the wind's blowing, where your relationship to the fire is at, and where the wind is blowing. And are you in the black, the area that's already burned, or are you in front of the fire? And then ultimately, making sure that your truck is operational. If you don't have the right gear, you're not wearing your helmet, your PPE, gloves, eye protection, the full mantra, you have no business on a wildfire scene. The potential for you being minorly injured is really high, and the potential for you being significantly injured is still high. Your PPE is there for a reason. Wear it. Now, the one thing I want to add to this is there's sometimes that you can't physically control events like the truck breaking down, or potentially you were foolish with your water and you wasted your water and you drove into a dangerous situation. In the event that that happens, you need to shelter in the truck. Stay with your truck. A couple of years ago when there was a fire up in the PK area, the one firefighter that died up there, he didn't die because of the fire. He died because the fire was getting close. Everyone went running, and he got hit by an apparatus that was driving away. He just wasn't in a truck, and he got hit and killed. Okay, now on this slide, what we're going to talk about is how Granbury's typically going to approach a wildland fire. All right, so you are on scene, and you will generally see something on a smaller fire that looks like this. And we're going to start at the back of the fire. Okay, the back of the fire is where the wind is blowing to. That's why the fire hasn't spread very far, because the wind is pushing against the fire spread. So when you make entry into the black, and we always want to fight a wildland fire from the black, you're going to put out a line of fire in the back. But I'm telling you, don't waste all your water at the back of the fire. What you want to do is when you drive into the black, you're going to pick a flank, either the right flank or a left flank. And then from there, what we're going to do is drive forward to the head. As you're driving, you're going to extinguish that flank. Now, the one thing I would recommend that you do in this process is make sure that you take out the fingers of the bays, the individual fire spreads, as you're going up the flank. The other thing that you need to be cognizant of is fire spots, spot fires. And those are going to be embers that are blown in the wind ahead of the fire, and they're creating more fires in front of the fire line itself. So as you're driving up the flank and extinguishing it, you're going to ultimately reach the head of the fire, and you may run out of water. All you do is turn around, fill up, get some more water, and then drive back out and repeat. Just continue down a flank until you ultimately get to the head of the fire. Here's the point of talking about all this. If you stay in the black of the fire and you stay there the whole time, let's say that you lose a glove or the truck breaks down or you run out of water. What hazard are you in? You're not. You're in an area that's already been consumed by fire. So if you stay in the truck or stay with your equipment, you don't have to worry about getting killed or trapped or burned. But if you get cute and you start trying to get ahead of the fire and you start getting in what's the green or the unburned area, and then the truck breaks down or you lose your equipment, you're putting yourself right in the line of sight of danger. Be very, very cognizant of always doing your best to stay in the black. And it's really not up for debate. If you stay in the black, you'll have a long, safe, fruitful, volunteer career fighting wildland fires. Alright guys, this is the very last slide. And what I want to talk about here just briefly are two different fire events that actually killed a lot of people that were wildland fires. The very first one is Storm King, and that actually occurred really close to where I grew up in Colorado. All of these individuals were smoke jumpers, and when they were fighting this fire, they were working on a very, very, very steep mountain, and I do mean steep. This thing's about 60 degrees. And the fire was about a mile below them at the time, and what they were trying to do was clear the area and do clear cutting and some back burns to get the fire extinguished. What ended up happening, though, is a massive wind change due to just typical incursions that happen every day in western Colorado in the afternoon. You have a large wind change, and that fire blew up. Well, the combination of the very steep terrain and the wind change, and that fire went straight uphill to that crew of 14, and it literally just burned right over them. From the start of the event to where they found the last body, the last person that tried to run, was about 100 yards. They estimated that the fire was moving at about 70 miles an hour when that crew died on Storm King. Now the bottom one is a little more recent. That's the Yarnell fire in Arizona. They were also a crew of hotshots. Now they didn't parachute into this fire, but it was just a series of just bad luck and just bad decisions made, and they put themselves in front of the fire. A wind change happened, and it killed all of these people. You have to be cognizant of what the weather is and what the wind is doing. If you stay in the black, this will not happen to you. Your ultimate safety on scene and the potential outcome of that scene is 100% meaningless in the event that you put yourself out there where you died literally trying to extinguish a grass fire. You weren't doing anything heroic. You died trying to save grass. And you really do need to put that into perspective and understand that there's no reason to be putting yourself in the position of being killed on a wildland scene.